When a desperate Apache family knocked on Margaret Chen's cabin door during a violent 1867 Arizona storm, the lonely widow faced a choice that would either save them all or destroy everything she had left. But as soldiers arrived hunting for hostile Indians, would Margaret's act of mercy become the very thing that finally gave her life meaning? Or would it be the last decision she'd ever make? The gun felt cold in Margaret's hands as she stared at the dusty road stretching toward nowhere. October heat shimmered off the Arizona ground like dancing ghosts, and she wondered if today would be the day she finally gave up fighting. Her small cabin sat alone in the desert, 15 miles from the nearest neighbor, with nothing but empty sky and broken dreams for company. 3 years had passed since the fever took James, her husband. 3 long years of talking to chickens and watching the sun rise over land that felt more like a prison than a home. Margaret pressed her face against the kitchen window, watching dust devils spin across the yard like tiny tornadoes. The silence pressed against her ears until she thought she might scream. Another day, she whispered to the empty room. Another day of nothing. Her reflection stared back from the glass. A woman of 34 who looked 50, with gray streaks in her brown hair and eyes that had forgotten how to sparkle. The Arizona territory was hard on women. Harder still, on women alone. Every morning brought the same choice: keep going or give up. Today, giving up felt easier. Margaret walked to the wooden box where James had kept his things. Inside lay his silver pocket watch, still ticking like a heartbeat. She wound it carefully, the way he'd taught her, then held it to her ear. The steady tick-tick-tick reminded her of better times, when their small cabin had rung with laughter and plans for the future. "We'll have children," James had promised, his arms around her as they watched the sunset paint the desert gold. Lots of children to fill this place with noise and joy. But the children never came. Month after month, year after year, her body failed to give them what they wanted most. The other women in town whispered behind their hands when she passed. "Poor Margaret Chen," they said, "barren as the desert. What use is a woman who can't have babies?" The cruel words echoed in her mind as she cleaned the breakfast dishes. One plate, one cup, one fork. Always one of everything. She'd stopped setting the table for 2 after the first year, but sometimes she still caught herself reaching for a second plate out of habit. Outside, her chickens clucked and scratched in their pen. At least they served a purpose, giving eggs and meat. Margaret envied them their simple lives. Wake up, eat, lay eggs, sleep, no dreams to be broken, no hopes to be crushed. She pulled on her sun hat and stepped outside to collect the eggs. The heat hit her like a wall, dry and burning. October in Arizona felt like summer anywhere else. The chickens scattered as she approached, their feathers ruffling in the hot breeze. "Morning, girls," she said, reaching into the nesting boxes. "At least you're useful." The words stung even as she spoke them. Was that what her life had become? A search for usefulness in a world that seemed to have no place for her? She'd been a teacher back in Missouri, before James convinced her to come west. Children had loved her then, gathering around her desk to hear stories and learn their letters. Now the closest school was 30 miles away, and they'd already hired a younger teacher, a married teacher with prospects for children of her own. Margaret's teaching certificate gathered dust in the wooden box with James's watch. A movement caught her eye near the horizon. 3 figures walked slowly across the desert, wavering in the heat like a mirage. Margaret shaded her eyes, trying to make out who would be crazy enough to travel on foot in this weather. Indians, maybe. The thought sent a chill through her despite the heat. Apache raids had been getting worse all summer. Just last month, they'd attacked a wagon train only 20 miles south. The territorial government kept promising more soldiers, but promises didn't stop arrows or bullets. Margaret touched the rifle hanging by her door, cold comfort against the endless emptiness. The figures disappeared behind a hill, and Margaret wondered if she'd imagined them. The desert played tricks on lonely minds, showing you what you wanted to see or what you feared most. She'd learned not to trust her eyes when the sun got too hot and the silence too deep. Back inside, she tried to focus on her daily tasks. Sweep the floor, tend the garden, mend the tear in her blue dress. Simple things that filled the hours between sunrise and sunset. But her mind kept drifting to the gun cabinet, to the loaded rifle that could end all the loneliness in one quick moment. "Stop it," she said aloud, her voice sharp in the quiet cabin. James wouldn't want that. But James was dead, and she was tired of living for a ghost. Tired of watching the sun rise on another empty day. Tired of listening to the wind whistle through the gaps in the walls. Tired of being the woman everyone pitied but no one wanted. She sat in James's old rocking chair, the one he'd carved from oak back in Missouri. It creaked under her weight, a familiar sound that usually brought comfort. Today it sounded like a door closing, like time running out. Through the window, she could see storm clouds building on the horizon. Dark and heavy, they promised rain for the thirsty desert. Margaret watched them roll closer, fascinated by their power. Nature could be cruel, but it could also be cleansing. Maybe the storm would wash away her doubts, or maybe it would give her the excuse she needed to make the choice she'd been avoiding. The first drops hit the window like tears, running down the glass in crooked lines. Margaret pressed her palm against the cool surface, feeling the vibration of thunder still miles away. The storm was coming whether she was ready or not. Lightning flickered in the distance, followed by a rumble that shook the small cabin. The chickens squawked and ran for cover, their natural instincts warning them to hide. Margaret envied them their simple fear, their ability to run when danger approached. She couldn't run. This cabin was all she had left, the only thing that connected her to James and the life they'd tried to build. But it was also her prison, keeping her trapped in memories and regrets. She'd become like the furniture, useful once, but now just taking up space. The storm grew stronger, rain drumming against the roof like urgent fingers. Margaret stood and walked to the gun cabinet, her hand trembling as she reached for the key. The rifle would be quick, she told herself. No more lonely mornings, no more empty conversations with chickens, no more watching other women's children play in the street. But as her fingers closed around the key, something stopped her. Not courage or hope, but curiosity. The storm was bringing something. She could feel it in the electric air, in the way the wind seemed to whisper secrets. Change was coming to her little corner of the desert, and despite everything, she wanted to see what it would bring. She dropped the key and returned to the window. The storm was almost upon her now, turning the world dark and wild. In the distance, she thought she saw those three figures again, closer now, struggling against the wind and rain. Real people, not mirages, caught in the fury of the desert storm. Margaret's heart began to beat faster. For the first time in months, she felt something besides despair. Not quite hope, but something close to it. The storm had brought visitors to her door, and she realized she wasn't ready to give up just yet. Thunder crashed overhead, and she gripped the window frame, watching the figures fight their way through the rain. They were heading straight for her cabin, and she had a choice to make. Open the door or keep it closed. Welcome strangers or turn them away. Live or die. The decision would change everything, though she didn't know it yet. All she knew was that her empty cabin was about to become something else entirely, and for the first time in years, Margaret Chen felt truly alive. The knock came soft against the storm's fury. 3 gentle taps that somehow carried more weight than thunder. Margaret's blood turned to ice water as she stared at the wooden door, her heart hammering like a trapped bird. Through the rain-streaked window, she could see them clearly now. 2 adults and a child, all Apache by their dress and bearing. Everything she'd been taught screamed danger. Apache warriors had been raiding settlements all summer, burning homesteads and killing families. The territorial newspaper ran stories weekly about savage attacks, about good Christian folk murdered in their beds. Her neighbor, old Pete Morrison, had lost his entire family to an Apache raid just 2 years past. Yet something about these 3 figures made her pause. The woman clutched a bundle to her chest, her body curved protectively around whatever she carried. The man swayed on his feet, clearly injured, while the child pressed close to her mother's side. They looked less like raiders and more like refugees, running from something rather than toward it. The baby's cry cut through the storm like a knife through silk. Margaret's hand flew to her throat, her breath catching. She knew that sound. The wail of a newborn in distress, thin and desperate. She'd heard it in her dreams for 3 years, the cry of the child she'd lost before birth, the baby that might have saved her marriage to James. "Please," came a man's voice, rough with exhaustion and pain. "My wife, the baby." Margaret's feet moved without her permission, carrying her toward the door. Her rational mind screamed warnings. They could be tricking her, using a baby to lower her guard. But her heart, the part that had been slowly dying for 3 years, suddenly roared to life. She lifted the wooden bar from the door and pulled it open. Rain swept into her cabin like a living thing, soaking her dress in seconds. The 3 figures stood on her threshold, water streaming from their dark hair and buckskin clothing. The man's left arm hung useless at his side, blood seeping through a crude bandage. The woman's face was pale with exhaustion, her eyes wide with desperation. "Please," the man repeated, his English heavily accented but clear. "Baby. Very sick." Margaret stepped back, her mind reeling. They were Apache, the people she'd been taught to fear above all others. But they were also a family in crisis, and the baby in the woman's arms was clearly dying. The tiny bundle lay too still, its breathing shallow and irregular. "Come in," she heard herself say. "Quickly, before you catch pneumonia." They stumbled inside, bringing the smell of rain and leather and something else. Fear. Not the predatory fear of hunters, but the desperate fear of the hunted. Margaret bolted the door behind them, then stood awkwardly in her kitchen, unsure what to do next. The woman sank into a chair, unwrapping the bundle with trembling hands. The baby was smaller than Margaret had expected, perhaps only weeks old. Its skin had a blue tinge that spoke of serious illness, and its breathing came in short, labored gasps. "How long has she been like this?" Margaret asked, her nursing instincts taking over. 2 days, the woman replied, her English clearer than her husband's. "Since the soldiers came." Margaret knelt beside the chair, gently placing her hand on the baby's chest. The heartbeat was rapid but weak, and the infant's lips were definitely blue. She'd seen this before, during her time helping the town doctor back in Missouri. The baby was struggling to breathe, probably from fluid in its lungs. "What's your name?" she asked the woman, trying to keep her voice calm. "Ayana," came the reply. "My husband is Nalnish. Our daughter is Siala." She nodded toward the child, who stood pressed against the wall, watching Margaret with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. "I'm Margaret," she said, then focused on the baby. "I need to help her breathe better. It might seem scary, but trust me." Ayana nodded, though her grip on the baby tightened. Margaret had delivered several babies back in Missouri, had helped the doctor with difficult births and sick infants. The knowledge felt rusty after 3 years of disuse, but it was there when she needed it. She tilted the baby's head back slightly, clearing the tiny mouth with her finger. Then, covering the infant's nose and mouth with her lips, she breathed gently into the small lungs. The baby's chest rose and fell, and Margaret felt the flutter of a stronger heartbeat. "Again," she whispered, and repeated the process. This time, the baby's eyes fluttered open, and a small cough escaped its throat. Not a death rattle, but the sound of lungs clearing. Ayana sobbed with relief, tears streaming down her face. She reached out and grasped Margaret's hand, squeezing it tight. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for giving back my daughter's life." Margaret felt something crack open inside her chest, not the painful breaking of loss, but something warm and expansive. When had she last felt useful? When had anyone last needed her skills, her knowledge, her help? "She's not out of danger yet," Margaret said, though she allowed herself a small smile. "But she's stronger than she looks." Behind them, Nalnish had collapsed into James's old rocking chair, his face gray with pain and exhaustion. The bloodstain on his shirt had spread, and Margaret could see he needed attention too. "Let me look at that wound," she said, moving toward him. He tried to wave her away, but the effort made him wince. "Is nothing," he said. "Just scratch." "That's not just a scratch," Margaret replied firmly. "That's a bullet wound, and it's getting infected." She'd seen plenty of gunshot wounds during the war when wounded soldiers had been brought to the Missouri town where she'd taught. The signs were unmistakable. The angry red streaks radiating from the wound, the fever flush on his skin, the way he favored his left side. "How did this happen?" she asked, helping him remove his shirt. "Soldiers," Siala said suddenly, her young voice carrying a weight of anger that made Margaret's heart ache. "They came to our camp, shot Papa when he tried to protect the horses." Margaret's hands stilled on the bandage. "What soldiers?" "Blue coats," Nalnish said, his voice growing weaker. "They said we steal cattle. We no steal. We have permission to hunt in the valley." "They burned everything," Ayana added, rocking the baby gently. "Our lodges, our food stores, everything. Said we were harboring raiders." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. She'd heard stories about overzealous soldiers, about peaceful Apache being mistaken for hostiles, but she'd always assumed the stories were exaggerated, that the military knew what they were doing. Are you from the reservation?" she asked carefully. Nalnish shook his head. "We work for Father Miguel at the mission. Tend his goats, help with the gardens. Good work, honest work." Margaret knew Father Miguel by reputation, a Jesuit priest who ran a small mission about 40 miles south. He was known for his work with peaceful Apache, teaching them farming and Christianity. If this family worked for him, they were probably exactly what they seemed. Innocent people caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. "The baby," she said, focusing on the wound. "Is she Father Miguel's goddaughter?" Ayana smiled for the first time since arriving. "Yes, he baptized her last month. Named her Maria Elena after his mother." The Spanish name sat oddly with the Apache features, but Margaret understood. These people were caught between worlds, trying to adapt to a changing landscape while holding on to their own traditions. It couldn't be easy. She finished cleaning Nalnish's wound, noting how he bore the pain without complaint. The bullet had passed through his shoulder, missing the bone but tearing muscle, and causing significant blood loss. He needed rest, food, and proper medical care. "You can't travel in this condition," she said. "The storm's getting worse, and you need time to heal." "We cannot stay," Nalnish replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "Too dangerous for you. If soldiers find us here, then we'll deal with that when it happens," Margaret said, surprising herself with her firmness. "Right now, your family needs shelter, and I have space." She looked around her small cabin, seeing it through new eyes. The second bedroom, empty for 3 years, could house the family. The kitchen was large enough for 5 people, and she had enough supplies to last several days. For the first time since James's death, her home felt like it had a purpose. "I have soup on the stove," she said, moving toward the kitchen. "And clean blankets in the back room. Ciala, are you hungry?" The child nodded shyly, and Margaret felt another crack in the wall she'd built around her heart. When had she last cooked for a child? When had her house last echoed with young voices? As she ladled soup into bowls, Margaret caught sight of her reflection in the window. The woman staring back looked different somehow, more alive, more purposeful. She was still the same barren widow who'd contemplated ending her life that morning, but she was also something else now. She was needed. The baby gurgled softly in Ayana's arms, and Margaret smiled. Storm or no storm, soldiers or no soldiers, she had a family under her roof for the first time in years. It might not last, but for now, it was enough. Outside, thunder rolled across the desert, and Margaret wondered what else the storm might bring. Blood soaked through the clean bandages faster than Margaret had expected, and Nalnish's fever was climbing toward dangerous levels. She pressed her hand against his forehead in the dim candlelight, feeling heat that could kill a man if it went much higher. The storm still raged outside, but inside her cabin, a different kind of battle was being fought. "The infection is spreading," she whispered to Ayana, who sat nearby nursing baby Maria Elena. "I need to clean the wound again, but it's going to hurt him badly." Ayana's dark eyes met hers with understanding. "He is strong. Do what you must." Margaret had learned field medicine during the war years, when wounded soldiers were brought to Missouri towns faster than doctors could treat them. She'd seen men die from infections that started smaller than Nalnish's wound. The red streaks creeping up his arm told a story she didn't want to finish. "Ciala," she called softly to the little girl who sat in the corner, watching everything with solemn eyes. "I need you to help me. Can you hold the candle steady while I work?" The 7-year-old nodded seriously, taking the candle with both hands. Her face showed no fear, only the grave responsibility of someone who'd learned too young that survival sometimes meant doing scary things. Margaret heated her knife blade in the candle flame, the way the army surgeon had taught her. The metal glowed red hot, and she knew what came next would test all of them. Nalnish was barely conscious, muttering words in Apache that sounded like prayers or goodbyes. "This will clean out the bad parts," she explained to Ayana, though she wasn't sure the woman wanted to know the details. "But the pain might make him cry out." "Our people have ways of bearing pain," Ayana replied, then began singing something low and melodic in her own language. The song seemed to calm not just Nalnish, but the whole room. Margaret pressed the hot blade against the infected tissue. and Nalnish's body went rigid. But instead of screaming, he gripped the arms of James's old rocking chair and breathed through clenched teeth. The chair creaked under the strain, and Margaret found herself thinking about how her husband had carved it with his own hands. "Almost done," she murmured, working quickly to remove the damaged flesh. The wound began bleeding fresh red blood, a good sign that meant healthy tissue was underneath. She packed it with clean cloth and bound it tight. When she finished, Nalnish had passed out from the pain, but his breathing seemed easier. The fever might break now that the infection was cleaned out. Margaret sat back on her heels, exhausted from the tension of the surgery. "You saved his life," Ayana said simply. "Our family owes you a debt we can never repay." Margaret looked around her small cabin, seeing how it had transformed in just a few hours. Wet clothes hung by the fire, filling the air with the smell of drying leather and wool. Baby Maria Elena slept peacefully in her mother's arms, her breathing steady and strong. Ciala had curled up on the floor with one of Margaret's quilts, finally looking like the child she was. "You don't owe me anything," Margaret replied. "This is the first time in 3 years this house has felt like a home." Through the window, lightning still flickered across the desert, but the worst of the storm seemed to be passing. Margaret realized she'd been so focused on caring for her unexpected guests that she'd forgotten about her own troubles. The gun cabinet in the corner might as well have been empty. She couldn't imagine wanting to use it now. "Tell me about the mission," she said, settling into a chair beside Ayana. "What's Father Miguel like?" Ayana's face softened. "He is a good man, very different from other white men we have known. When our band was forced from our homeland, he offered work to families who wanted to live in peace. No fighting, no raiding, just honest labor." "And your husband tends goats?" "Nalnish was a warrior once, before the wars became too much. Now he prefers to care for living things instead of destroying them." Ayana adjusted the baby in her arms. "The goats know him, trust him. He says they are easier to understand than people." Margaret smiled at that. She'd often thought the same thing about her chickens. Animals had simple needs and honest reactions. They didn't judge you for being childless or widowed or different. "What about you?" she asked. "What do you do at the mission?" "I teach the children to weave, to make baskets and pottery. Father Miguel says it is important to keep the old ways alive, even as we learn new ones." Ayana's voice carried pride, mixed with sadness. "Ciala learns both Apache songs and Christian hymns. She reads English and Spanish, but I make sure she remembers the stories of our grandmothers." The complexity of their situation struck Margaret forcefully. These weren't the savage raiders described in newspaper stories. They were a family trying to build a bridge between two worlds, keeping one foot in their heritage while stepping toward an uncertain future. "The soldiers who attacked your camp," Margaret said carefully, "did they give any warning? Any chance to explain who you were?" Ayana's expression darkened. "Captain Morrison led them. He said all Apache looked the same to him, peaceful or not. When Nalnish tried to show our papers from Father Miguel, Morrison knocked him down and called him a liar." Margaret's blood chilled. She knew Captain Morrison by reputation, a hard man who believed the only good Indian was a dead Indian. He'd been leading patrols through the territory all summer, claiming he was protecting settlers from raids. But if he was attacking peaceful families too, he was creating the very problem he claimed to solve. "Morrison has been asking questions around town," she said slowly, "about which ranchers have hired Apache workers, which families might be hiding raiders. He thinks every Apache camp is a war party waiting to attack. Men like him see only what they choose to see," Ayana replied. "We are not people to him, just targets for his hatred." The baby stirred and made soft cooing sounds. Ayana smiled and began singing again, the same lullaby from before. Margaret found herself humming along, though she didn't know the words. Music seemed to cross all boundaries. "Your husband," Ayana said suddenly. "Ciala asked me where he is. I told her he walks with the spirits now, but she wants to know if you miss him." The question caught Margaret off guard. She'd grown so used to avoiding thoughts of James that discussing him with a stranger felt strange. But there was something about Ayana's gentle manner that invited honesty. "Every day," Margaret admitted. "But lately, I've been wondering if I miss the man he was, or just the idea of not being alone." "Loneliness can be its own sickness," Ayana said. "I have seen women waste away from it, even when surrounded by people. The heart needs purpose as much as the body needs food." Through the window, Margaret could see the first pale light of dawn beginning to edge the eastern mountains. The storm had passed completely, leaving the desert washed clean and sparkling. Everything looked different in the gentle morning light, sharper, more alive. "I should check on the animals," Margaret said, rising from her chair. "Make sure the chickens survived the storm." Outside, the air smelled fresh and sweet, with the unique scent that came after desert rains. Her chickens had indeed survived, though they squawked indignantly about their wet feathers. Margaret scattered corn for them and collected the eggs, marveling at how normal the task felt, despite everything that had changed. When she returned to the cabin, she found Ciala awake and examining the books on Margaret's shelf. The child ran her finger along the spines, sounding out titles under her breath. "You can read English very well," Margaret observed, setting down the egg basket. "Father Miguel teaches all the children," Ciala replied proudly. "He says knowledge is a tool that no one can take away from you, no matter what happens." The wisdom in those words struck Margaret deeply. Here was a 7-year-old who understood things about survival and resilience that Margaret was only beginning to grasp. This child had lost her home, seen her father shot, and fled through a dangerous storm. Yet she still believed in the power of learning. "Would you like me to read you one of these stories?" Margaret offered. Ciala's face lit up. "Yes, please. I love stories." Margaret pulled down a collection of fairy tales, settling into the rocking chair with Ciala beside her. As she began reading about brave princesses and clever peasants, she realized this was the first time in years she'd read aloud to a child. Her voice, rusty from disuse, grew stronger as the story unfolded. Nalnish stirred in his sleep, and Margaret paused to check his forehead. The fever had broken during the night, and his breathing was deep and steady. He would live, she realized with relief. Her amateur surgery had worked. "Is my papa going to be all right?" Ciala asked, worry creeping into her young voice. "Yes," Margaret said firmly. "He's very strong, and the medicine is working. By tomorrow, he'll be much better." But even as she spoke reassuring words, Margaret's mind was racing ahead to practical problems. Morrison's patrol would be looking for this family, and it wouldn't take long for them to search every homestead in the area. Her cabin was isolated, but it wasn't invisible. She needed a plan, and she needed it soon, because keeping this family safe was no longer just about basic human decency. It had become the most important thing in her world. The sound of approaching horses cut through the morning air like a blade through silk, and Margaret's heart stopped beating for a full second before hammering back to life. She pressed her face against the window, counting riders as they emerged from the heat shimmer on the horizon. 6 men in blue uniforms, riding hard toward her cabin with the confidence of hunters who'd found their prey. "Hide," she whispered urgently to Ayana, who was already gathering baby Maria Elena. "Take them to the root cellar, quickly." Nalnish struggled to sit up from the bed where they'd moved him during the night. His face was pale but determined. "I will not hide while you face danger for us. You can barely stand." Margaret shot back, her voice sharper than she intended. "And if they find you here, we're all dead." The truth of those words hung in the air like smoke. Captain Morrison wasn't known for asking questions first and shooting later. If he found Apache in her cabin, he'd assume the worst and act accordingly. Ciala grabbed her father's good hand. "Papa, please. The nice lady is trying to help us." Something in the child's voice seemed to reach Nalnish where Margaret's arguments couldn't. He nodded slowly and allowed Ayana to help him toward the hidden cellar door behind the kitchen pantry. Margaret had never been so grateful for James's paranoid habit of preparing for Indian raids. "Whatever happens," she told them as they disappeared below, "stay quiet, no matter what you hear." The riders were close enough now that she could make out Captain Morrison's scarred face and the gleaming brass buttons on his uniform. Margaret smoothed her dress, checked her hair in the mirror, and tried to arrange her features into something resembling normalcy. Her hands shook as she reached for the door handle. "Mrs. Chen," Morrison's voice boomed across the yard before she could open the door. "Step outside where we can see you." Margaret lifted the wooden bar and stepped onto her small porch, shading her eyes against the morning sun. 6 armed soldiers sat their horses in a semicircle around her cabin, their rifles loose in their hands but ready for action. "Captain Morrison," she called back, trying to keep her voice steady. "What brings you out so early?" Morrison dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with authority. He was a tall man, lean as a whip, with cold gray eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. Behind him, his men remained mounted, watching the windows and corners of her cabin for any sign of movement. "Tracking hostiles, ma'am," Morrison replied, walking closer to the porch. "Apache raiders hit a supply wagon yesterday evening, killed 2 good men. We followed their trail this direction." Margaret's mouth went dry. "I haven't seen anyone, Captain. The storm kept me inside all night." Morrison's eyes narrowed as he studied her face. "Funny thing about that storm. Washed out most tracks, but we did find some interesting signs about a mile south. Moccasin prints heading toward your place." The lie came easier than Margaret expected. "Could have been from days ago. You know Apache travel through this area all the time." "That's exactly the problem," Morrison said, stepping onto her porch without invitation. "Too many of these savages moving freely through settler territory. Time to clean house." Up close, Margaret could smell whiskey on his breath and see the red veins in his eyes. He'd been drinking, which made him even more dangerous than usual. Drunk soldiers made poor decisions, and poor decisions got people killed. "I'd like to search your property, Mrs. Chen, just to make sure you're safe." It wasn't really a request, and they both knew it. Margaret stepped aside, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Of course, Captain, though I'm not sure what you expect to find." Morrison pushed past her into the cabin, his eyes sweeping the main room like a predator scenting prey. He noticed the extra dishes on the table immediately, 4 plates instead of 1, cups still damp from washing. "Entertaining company, Mrs. Chen?" Margaret's mind raced. "The storm broke some branches against my roof. I was checking for damage this morning and thought I might have visitors later. The neighbor women sometimes stop by after storms to check on each other." "Which neighbors would those be?" Morrison asked, running his finger along the edge of a plate. "Seeing as how your closest neighbor is 12 miles away and hasn't spoken to you in 2 years. The casual cruelty of his words hit Margaret like a slap. She'd forgotten how much the townspeople talked, how her isolation had become a source of gossip and speculation. In Morrison's eyes, she was just a crazy widow woman whose word couldn't be trusted. "Maybe I was just being hopeful," she said quietly. Morrison laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Hopeful? Mrs. Chen, you've been alone out here so long you're starting to see things. Probably heard voices in the storm. Set extra plates for ghost visitors." He moved toward the back of the cabin, and Margaret's blood turned to ice water. The cellar door was hidden, but not perfectly. If he looked carefully enough, examined the floorboards near the pantry, he might notice the unusual gaps. "Captain," she said quickly, "would you like some coffee? I just put a fresh pot on." Morrison paused, considering. "Coffee sounds good. Been writing since before dawn." Margaret busied herself with cups and the coffee pot, trying to keep her hands from shaking. Through the window, she could see Morrison's men watering their horses at her well. They looked tired and frustrated, like hunters who'd been chasing shadows all night. "Tell me about these raiders," she said, hoping to distract Morrison from his search. "What did they take from the wagon?" "Rifles, ammunition, medical supplies," Morrison replied, accepting the coffee cup. "Professional job, which means they're planning something big. These aren't random raids anymore, Mrs. Chen. They're preparing for war." The coffee was too hot, but Margaret sipped it anyway, using the motion to hide her expression. If Apache raiders really were organizing for war, then families like Nalnish's were caught in an impossible position. Too Apache for white society, too peaceful for the war bands. "What will you do when you catch them?" she asked. Morrison's smile was cold. "Same thing we do with all hostiles. Court-martial is too good for savages who murder civilians." The casual way he talked about execution made Margaret's stomach turn. She thought about Ciala hiding in the cellar below, probably listening to every word. What must it feel like to be 7 years old and hear grown men discuss killing your people like they were talking about exterminating rats? A baby's cry echoed faintly through the floorboards. Morrison's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto Margaret's face. "What was that?" "What was what?" Margaret asked, though her voice sounded strange even to her own ears. The cry came again, muffled but unmistakable. Morrison set down his coffee cup and drew his pistol in one smooth motion. "That's a baby crying, Mrs. Chen. And you just told me you haven't seen anyone." Margaret's world tilted sideways. All her planning, all her careful lies, undone by an infant's natural needs. She could lie about dishes and hope Morrison would believe her, but she couldn't explain away a crying baby. She began, then stopped. There was no point in more lies. Morrison moved toward the sound, his gun trained on the floorboards. Where are they, Mrs. Chen? How many? They're not raiders, Margaret said quickly. They're a family from the mission. Father Miguel's people. The baby was sick, and they needed help. Father Miguel's people? Morrison's laugh was ugly. Lady, you've been talking to liars. There is no Father Miguel. That mission was abandoned 2 years ago after the priest got himself killed in an Apache raid. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. If Morrison was telling the truth, then everything Nalnish and Ayana had told her was a lie. They weren't peaceful mission workers. They were exactly what Morrison said they were. Raiders who had used her sympathy to gain shelter. But even as the doubt crept in, Margaret remembered the gentle way Ayana had sung to her baby. The pride in Ciala's voice when she talked about learning to read. These weren't the actions of savage killers. You're wrong, she said firmly. I've seen them with the baby. They're good people. Morrison kicked at the floorboards, searching for the hidden entrance. Good people? Mrs. Chen, these good people probably killed Father Miguel themselves, and now they're going to kill you too, soon as they think it's safe. The cellar door burst open as Nalnish emerged, moving faster than a wounded man should have been able to move. His good arm swung a piece of firewood at Morrison's head, connecting with a solid thunk that sent the captain sprawling. Run, Nalnish shouted to his family. Take the baby and run. But Ayana was already climbing out of the cellar, Maria Elena in her arms, and there was nowhere to go. Through the windows, Margaret could see Morrison's soldiers rushing toward the cabin, alerted by the commotion inside. Morrison rolled to his feet, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. His eyes burned with rage as he raised his pistol toward Nalnish. Now you're all going to die. Margaret stepped between them without thinking, her arms spread wide. No, I won't let you murder them in my home. Get out of the way, Mrs. Chen, Morrison snarled. These savages have been playing you for a fool. Maybe they have, Margaret replied, but shooting an unarmed man with a baby watching isn't justice. It's just murder. The standoff stretched like a taut wire, seconds feeling like hours. Through the window, Margaret could see soldiers surrounding the cabin, rifles ready. Ciala pressed against her mother's leg, her young face frozen with terror. The baby gurgled softly, oblivious to the danger surrounding her. In that moment, Margaret realized she'd found something worth fighting for, maybe dying for. These people had trusted her with their lives, and she wasn't going to let them down, even if it killed her. Morrison's gun wavered between Margaret and Nalnish as the sound of galloping horses thundered toward the cabin from an unexpected direction. Through the dust cloud, a figure in black robes rode hard, his horse foam-flecked and wild-eyed from being pushed beyond its limits. Father Miguel himself burst through Morrison's ring of soldiers, his face blazing with righteous fury. Captain Morrison! The priest shouted, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. What is the meaning of this outrage? Morrison's face went white, as if he'd seen a ghost. His gun hand dropped slightly as he stared at the very man he'd claimed was dead. Father, but you're, the report said. The report said many things. Most of them lie spread by men who profit from fear. Father Miguel strode past the startled soldiers and into the cabin, his dark eyes taking in the scene instantly. Nalnish, my friend, what have they done to you? The Apache man's shoulders sagged with relief. Father, they attacked our camp, said we were raiders. My family barely escaped. Father Miguel's face hardened as he turned back to Morrison. These people work for my mission, Captain. They are under the protection of the church and the territorial government. Do you have papers authorizing you to arrest mission workers? Morrison's jaw worked furiously, but no words came out. Margaret could see him calculating, trying to find a way to salvage his authority. Around the cabin, his soldiers shifted nervously, unsure whether they were supposed to be pointing guns at a priest. There was a raid yesterday, Morrison finally managed. Supply wagon hit, 2 men killed. We followed tracks. You followed the tracks of the men who attacked this family's camp, Father Miguel interrupted. The same raiders who have been terrorizing peaceful Apache for months. While you chase innocent families, the real killers escape. Margaret felt the tension in the room shift like weather changing. Morrison's certainty was cracking, and she could see doubt creeping into his men's faces. But cornered animals were often the most dangerous. Even if that's true, Morrison said, his voice growing desperate. This woman harbored fugitives. That's still a crime. What crime? Father Miguel demanded. Giving shelter to a sick baby? Treating a wounded man? Since when is Christian charity against the law in Arizona territory? Ciala stepped forward suddenly, her small voice cutting through the adult arguments. Captain Morrison, why did you hurt my papa? We never did anything bad to you. The simple question from a child seemed to hit Morrison harder than any of the priest's arguments. For a moment, his mask slipped, and Margaret saw something like shame flicker across his face. Then it was gone, replaced by stubborn anger. Children don't understand these things, he muttered. No, Margaret said, finding her voice again. They understand them perfectly. They understand that you shot an unarmed man for no reason except the color of his skin. Morrison spun toward her, his face flushing red. You don't know what you're talking about, lady. I've seen what these people do to white families. The torture, the burning. Have you seen this family do those things? Father Miguel asked quietly. Or are you punishing them for the sins of others? The question hung in the air like smoke. Through the windows, Margaret could see more riders approaching. Not soldiers this time, but civilians from town. Word was spreading about the confrontation, and people were coming to see what would happen. Morrison seemed to realize his position was weakening. With witnesses arriving and a priest vouching for the Apache family, his justification for violence was crumbling. But he wasn't ready to admit defeat. Papers, he said suddenly. I want to see official papers proving these people work for your mission. Father Miguel reached into his robes and produced a leather folder. Baptismal certificates, work permits, letters of recommendation, everything in order and signed by the territorial governor himself. As Morrison examined the documents, his face grew darker. The papers were genuine. Margaret could tell from his expression that he'd found no flaws in them. Nalnish, Ayana, and even little Ciala were exactly what they claimed to be. The baby, Morrison said desperately. Where are her papers? She's 3 weeks old, Ayana said softly. Her papers are being prepared, but she was born at the mission under Father Miguel's care. Margaret watched Morrison's last hope of justification slip away. The Apache family was legal, documented, and under official protection. He'd attacked innocent people and been caught doing it in front of witnesses. But instead of backing down, Morrison's desperation made him more dangerous. He raised his gun again, this time pointing it directly at Father Miguel. Maybe the papers are forgeries, he said. Maybe you're all in this together. Priest helping savages, widow woman turned traitor. Time to clean house once and for all. The threat to a man of God seemed to shock even Morrison's own soldiers. Margaret heard one of them curse under his breath, saw another lower his rifle entirely. They'd signed up to fight Apache raiders, not to murder priests and babies. Captain, one of the soldiers called from outside. We got company. Lotta company. Through the window, Margaret could see a crowd gathering. Townspeople, ranchers, other settlers, drawn by the commotion. Some carried guns, others just came to watch. But their presence changed everything. Morrison couldn't simply massacre everyone now, not with half the territory watching. Father Miguel stepped closer to Morrison, unafraid of the gun pointed at his chest. Captain, you have a choice to make. You can admit your mistake and withdraw with some dignity intact, or you can continue down this path and face the consequences. What consequences? Morrison snarled. The consequence of explaining to your superiors why you attacked a Catholic mission family, threatened a priest, and held an innocent woman at gunpoint. Father Miguel's voice carried quiet authority. The consequence of facing a territorial investigation into your conduct. The consequence of losing your commission and possibly your freedom. Margaret could see the calculation happening behind Morrison's eyes. He was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and rapidly running out of options. But pride and prejudice died hard, especially in men who'd built their identity around being right. The baby chose that moment to cry again, the sound somehow cutting through all the tension and anger. Ayana rocked her gently, murmuring Apache words of comfort. In that moment, Margaret saw the scene as it really was. Armed men, threatening a mother and her infant child. Enough, she said firmly. stepping between Morrison and the family. "This is my home, Captain. These people are my guests. If you want to arrest someone, arrest me, but leave this family alone." The standoff stretched like a violin string about to snap, until a new voice cut through the tension from outside the cabin. "Captain Morrison, stand down immediately!" Colonel Bradley of Fort Verde rode into the yard with a full company of cavalry, his uniform crisp, despite the hard ride through desert heat. Morrison's gun hand began to shake as he realized his career was likely over. "Colonel, sir, I can explain. These are hostile Apache, and this woman was harboring them." "I can see exactly what's happening here, Captain," Bradley replied, dismounting with deliberate precision. "You're holding a priest, a civilian woman, and a family with an infant at gunpoint. That requires quite an explanation indeed." Margaret felt the shift in power like a physical weight lifting from her shoulders. Colonel Bradley was known as a fair man, someone who followed regulations rather than personal prejudices. Morrison's rogue behavior would not sit well with military command. Father Miguel stepped forward, his documents ready. "Colonel, these people are mission workers under official protection. Captain Morrison attacked their camp without provocation, wounded Nailnish, and then pursued them here. Is this true, Captain?" Bradley's voice carried the ice of military discipline. Morrison's face cycled through anger, fear, and desperation. "Sir, there was a wagon attack yesterday. Apache raiders killed 2 men. I was pursuing the perpetrators." "Did you identify these specific individuals as the attackers?" The question hung in the desert air like heat shimmer. Morrison opened his mouth, then closed it again. They all knew the answer. He'd attacked the camp based on assumption and prejudice, not evidence. "Apache looked the same in the dark," Morrison said weakly. "That is not an acceptable answer, Captain." Bradley's tone could have frozen water in July. "Surrender your weapon immediately." For a moment, Margaret thought Morrison might refuse. His gun was still pointed at Father Miguel, his finger on the trigger. But the sound of 30 rifles being cocked simultaneously by Bradley's soldiers seemed to convince him. He lowered his weapon and handed it to his commanding officer. "Sergeant Williams," Bradley called to one of his men, "place Captain Morrison under arrest pending a full investigation." As Morrison was led away in shackles, Margaret finally allowed herself to breathe. Nailnish slumped against the wall, exhaustion and relief written across his face. Ayana clutched baby Maria Elena tighter, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Ma'am," Colonel Bradley said, approaching Margaret with respectful formality, "I apologize for this incident. The territorial government takes very seriously any attacks on mission personnel or their families." "They're not just mission personnel," Margaret heard herself saying. "They're good people who needed help. That should be reason enough." Bradley nodded approvingly. "Indeed it should. Father Miguel, what assistance do your people require?" "Medical attention for Nailnish's wound, safe transport back to the mission, and assurance that this won't happen again," the priest replied. "Consider it done." Bradley turned to his men. "Establish a protective detail for this family's journey home, and send word to all patrol commanders. Mission workers are to be treated with full respect and protection." As the soldiers organized the escort, Margaret realized her part in this story was ending. The Apache family would return to their life at the mission, she would go back to her empty cabin, and everything would return to the way it was before. Except she couldn't imagine returning to that emptiness now. 3 days ago, she'd been ready to give up on life entirely. Now she felt more alive than she had in years. "Mrs. Chen," Ayana said softly, approaching with the baby. "Will you hold her once more? I think she knows your voice." Margaret took little Maria Elena in her arms, marveling at how much stronger the infant seemed since that first terrible night. The baby's dark eyes focused on her face, with the trust only the very young could offer. "She's beautiful," Margaret whispered. "Perfect." "You saved her life," Ayana replied. "In our tradition, that makes you family. Always." The word family hit Margaret like a physical blow. She'd spent so long thinking of herself as alone, as someone nobody wanted or needed. But this Apache woman was offering her something she'd never expected to find: belonging. "The mission always needs teachers," Father Miguel said, as if reading her thoughts. "People who can help bridge the gap between different worlds. Your nursing skills alone would be invaluable." Margaret looked around her cabin one last time. It had been her prison for 3 years. the place where she'd slowly died inside. But it had also been the place where she'd rediscovered her capacity for courage and compassion. "I don't know anything about mission work," she said hesitantly. "You know about healing," Ciala piped up. "And you tell good stories. That's what teachers do." From the mouths of babes, Margaret thought. This 7-year-old understood something that had taken Margaret 34 years to learn. That value came not from what others expected of you, but from what you chose to give. "I'd like to visit," she said finally. "To see how Maria Elena is doing, of course." Father Miguel smiled. "Of course, and if you decide you'd like to stay longer, there will always be a place for you." As the escort prepared to leave, Margaret found herself making a choice she never could have imagined 3 days earlier. She was going to lock up her cabin, pack her few precious belongings, and ride south toward a new life. The woman who'd contemplated ending her story was about to begin a completely new chapter. 6 months later, Margaret's hands were covered in clay, and her heart was fuller than it had been in years. But the letter, trembling in Ciala's grip, threatened to destroy everything they'd built together. The child burst into the mission schoolhouse, where Margaret was teaching pottery to a dozen Apache children, her young face streaked with tears and panic. "Mrs. Margaret, soldiers are coming again. Different soldiers, but they have papers," Ciala gasped, holding up an official-looking document. "They say all Apache have to go to the reservation. Even us. Even the babies." Margaret's blood turned to ice as she read the government order. The Indian Removal Act was being enforced with new strictness, and even peaceful mission Apache were to be relocated to the San Carlos Reservation immediately. No exceptions, no appeals, no consideration for families who had committed no crimes. "When?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tomorrow morning. Father Miguel is meeting with the officer now, but the man says his orders are final." Ciala wiped her nose with her sleeve. "Mama is crying. Papa says we might never see you again." Around the classroom, the other Apache children had gone silent, their dark eyes wide with fear. They'd heard stories about San Carlos, a barren stretch of desert where different tribes were forced together with little food, less water, and no hope of return. It was where Apache went to die slowly instead of quickly. Margaret set down her clay tools and gathered the children around her. "Listen to me carefully," she said, her teacher's voice steady despite her racing heart. "No matter what happens, you must remember what you've learned here. The reading, the writing, the stories. Knowledge lives in your heads and hearts where no one can take it away." But even as she spoke reassuring words, her mind was spinning with desperate plans. There had to be something she could do, some way to fight this injustice. These children weren't enemies of the state. They were students learning to read, families learning to farm, people building bridges between two worlds. Father Miguel appeared in the doorway, his face gray with defeat. "Margaret, I need to speak with you privately." They stepped outside into the mission courtyard, where the late afternoon sun painted everything gold and peaceful. It was hard to believe that by tomorrow, this place might be empty of the laughter and voices that had brought it to life. "The commanding officer is Lieutenant Jackson," Father Miguel said quietly. "Young by the book, completely unwilling to consider exceptions. He says the territorial government has decided that scattered Apache communities pose too great a security risk." "Security risk?" Margaret's voice rose with indignation. "These people grow vegetables and tend goats. The most dangerous thing Nalnish has done in 6 months is accidentally let the chickens into the bean garden." "I know, but Jackson has his orders, and he's the type who follows them regardless of circumstances." Father Miguel rubbed his temples. "I've sent word to Colonel Bradley, but he's been transferred to California. The new fort commander doesn't know our situation." Through the mission walls, Margaret could hear the sounds of families packing their few belongings, children asking questions their parents couldn't answer, mothers singing lullabies to babies who might grow up never knowing any home but the reservation. "There has to be something," she said desperately. "Some legal challenge, some appeal process." "The Apache have no legal standing," Father Miguel replied with bitter honesty. "They're wards of the government, not citizens. They have no rights that white men are bound to respect." The casual cruelty of those words hit Margaret like a physical blow. In 6 months at the mission, she'd watched Nalnish become an expert gardener, whose crops fed half the community. She'd seen Ayana teach traditional weaving patterns to Mexican women, creating beautiful blankets that sold in towns throughout the territory. She'd helped Ciala progress from reading simple stories to writing her own poems in both English and Apache. These weren't wards or problems to be managed. They were people building meaningful lives, contributing to their community, raising children with hope for the future. But in the eyes of the law, none of that mattered. "What about the children?" Margaret asked. Surely they wouldn't separate families. Father Miguel's expression grew even more grim. Jackson suggested that the children might be better served in government boarding schools, away from savage influences, as he put it. Margaret felt her world tilt sideways. They weren't just talking about relocation anymore. They were talking about destroying families entirely. Taking children from their parents, erasing their culture, turning them into something neither Apache nor white but lost between both worlds. "Over my dead body," she said quietly. "Margaret, be careful. Jackson specifically asked about you, the white woman living among the Apache. He seems to think you've been corrupted by prolonged contact with Indians." The warning sent a chill through Margaret's bones. She'd heard stories about white women who sided too strongly with Apache causes. They were labeled traitors, stripped of their property, sometimes even arrested. But the thought of losing her new family was worse than any legal threat. "I need to see this Lieutenant Jackson myself," she decided. "That might not be wise. Your position here is already precarious." "My position?" Margaret almost laughed. 6 months ago, I was ready to kill myself out of loneliness. These people saved my life just as much as I helped save theirs. I'm not going to abandon them now. That evening, Margaret sat with Nalnish and Ayana in their small adobe house. Baby Maria Elena sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms. The infant had grown into a healthy, curious child who knew Margaret's voice almost as well as her parents. She'd taken her first steps just last week, toddling across the room toward Margaret with a giggle of pure joy. "We have been happy here," Nalnish said simply. "For the first time since the wars began, we have been able to live in peace. Our children learn without fear. Our families grow strong." "The reservation," Ayana's voice trailed off. She didn't need to finish the sentence. They all knew what San Carlos meant. Overcrowding, disease, despair, and the slow death of everything that made Apache culture unique. "Maybe it won't be forever," Margaret said, though the words felt hollow even to her. "Maybe things will change." "Things change," Ciala agreed from her corner, where she was carefully packing her few books. "But people remember. I will remember everything you taught me, Mrs. Margaret, even if they take me far away." The simple dignity in the child's voice broke Margaret's heart. Here was a 9-year-old facing the destruction of her world with more grace than most adults could muster. She'd learned to read and write in 2 languages, absorbed stories from both Apache and European traditions, and somehow maintained hope despite everything. "You won't have to remember from far away," Margaret said suddenly, the decision crystallizing in her mind. "Because I'm coming with you." Ayana's head snapped up. "What?" "I'm coming to San Carlos. As a teacher, a nurse, whatever they'll let me be. These children need education, and the reservation needs medical care. I can provide both." Nalnish leaned forward, his dark eyes intense. "Margaret, you do not understand what you are saying. The reservation is not like here. It is a hard place, a place of broken spirits." "Then it needs people who refuse to be broken," Margaret replied. "Besides, where else am I going to go? Back to my empty cabin? Back to talking to chickens and waiting to die?" The truth was simpler than her brave words suggested. Over the past 6 months, this Apache family had become her family in every way that mattered. Ciala called her Aunt Margaret and ran to her with scraped knees and exciting discoveries. Maria Elena reached for her with chubby arms and babbled sounds that almost seemed like Mama Ret. Nalnish and Ayana had welcomed her into their daily life with a generosity that still amazed her. She couldn't imagine going back to her old life of isolation and slow despair. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The government might not allow it. Father Miguel warned when she told him of her decision. Civilians aren't usually permitted to live on reservations. "Then I'll apply to be a government teacher," Margaret said firmly. "The reservation schools always need staff, white staff who can civilize the Indian children. I'll use their own prejudices against them." It was a risky plan, full of unknowns and potential disasters. But as Margaret looked around the mission courtyard one last time, watching Apache families prepare for an uncertain future with quiet dignity, she knew she'd made the right choice. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new heartbreaks, and new tests of everything she'd learned about courage and family. But tonight, she was exactly where she belonged, surrounded by people who'd taught her that love wasn't about blood or law or government papers. Love was about choosing to stay when leaving would be easier, choosing to fight when surrender seemed smarter, choosing hope when despair felt more realistic. And Margaret Chen had finally learned how to choose. 2 years later, Margaret stood before a congressional committee in Washington, D.C., her hands steady as she held photographs that could change the fate of every Apache on the San Carlos reservation. The images showed children who'd learned to read despite having no books, families who'd built gardens in the desert despite having no tools, and people who'd maintained their dignity despite living in conditions that would break most spirits. "Gentlemen," she said to the room full of lawmakers who'd never set foot on a reservation, "these photographs tell a story your official reports will never show you. The Apache people of San Carlos aren't the savage enemies you've been told about. They're farmers, teachers, parents, and children who want nothing more than the chance to live peacefully." Senator Williams, the committee chairman, adjusted his spectacles and frowned at the images. "Mrs. Chen, your emotional attachment to these people is well documented. But surely you understand that policy must be based on broader considerations than individual sympathy." Margaret had expected this response. In 2 years at San Carlos, she'd learned that politicians preferred statistics to stories, theories to truth. But she'd also learned something else: how to fight a system that saw Apache people as problems rather than human beings. "Senator, let me share some statistics with you," she replied, pulling out a leather folder. "In the 2 years since the forced relocation began, the death rate at San Carlos has increased by 40%. Malnutrition affects 60% of the children. Disease outbreaks occur monthly because of overcrowding and poor sanitation." The numbers had weight that her photographs lacked, and she could see several committee members taking notes. But Senator Williams remained unmoved. "Regrettable, certainly, but the security benefits of consolidation outweigh these temporary hardships. Scattered Apache bands posed a constant threat to territorial expansion." "What threat?" Margaret's voice rose, despite her efforts to stay calm. "The families I work with grow food that feeds white settlements. They serve as scouts for the army, tracking actual raiders. They've prevented more attacks than they've ever caused." Congressman Foster leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "You're saying peaceful Apache actively help fight hostile bands?" "I'm saying there's no such thing as a unified Apache resistance. There are dozens of different groups with different leaders, different goals, different relationships with the government." Margaret had rehearsed this explanation countless times. Punishing peaceful families for the actions of raiders is like blaming all white settlers for the crimes of outlaws. The comparison was risky. It suggested Apache people deserve the same consideration as white citizens. But Margaret had learned that sometimes you had to push boundaries to move them. Back at San Carlos, the situation had grown more desperate each month. What had been designed as temporary housing for a few hundred, Apache had swollen to hold nearly 4,000 people from different tribes who'd been enemies for generations. The reservation was a powder keg of old grievances, cultural conflicts, and shared desperation. Margaret had thrown herself into teaching with fierce determination, but the challenges seemed insurmountable. She had no proper schoolhouse, no books, no supplies beyond what she could beg from sympathetic contacts back east. Yet somehow, the children learned. Ciala, now 11, had become her unofficial assistant teacher, helping younger children with their letters while maintaining her own Apache language and traditions. The girl had grown into a bridge between worlds, comfortable speaking English with government officials in the morning and Apache with her grandmother in the evening. The children adapt faster than the adults, Margaret had written to Father Miguel. They're learning to navigate multiple cultures simultaneously, creating something new that's neither fully traditional nor fully assimilated. It was this adaptation that had given Margaret the idea for her congressional testimony. If she could show lawmakers that Apache people weren't disappearing or becoming civilized in the way policy intended, but instead creating vibrant mixed communities, perhaps she could argue for a different approach entirely. Congressman Foster was still asking questions, What specific changes would you recommend, Mrs. Chen? Margaret took a deep breath. This was the moment everything depended on. Her chance to advocate for real change rather than just sympathy. First, establish day schools on or near the reservation instead of sending children to distant boarding schools. Families stay together, but children still receive education. Second, provide proper medical facilities and trained personnel. Disease prevention costs far less than treating epidemics. Third, allow Apache men to serve as paid scouts and interpreters. They know the territory better than any white soldier. And fourth, Senator Williams asked, though his tone suggested he was already skeptical, give them legal title to individual homesteads, not reservations they can be moved from at government whim, but actual property they can improve, farm, and pass to their children. People with something to lose don't become raiders. The suggestion caused a stir around the committee table. Private property for Indians was a radical concept that challenged basic assumptions about federal Indian policy. That would make them citizens, Congressman Foster said slowly. Eventually, yes. Is that so terrible? They pay taxes on goods they buy, follow territorial laws, serve in the military when called upon. Why shouldn't they have the rights that come with those responsibilities? Senator Williams shuffled his papers, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Mrs. Chen, you're proposing to overturn decades of established policy based on your personal experiences with a handful of individuals. I'm proposing to base policy on evidence instead of prejudice, Margaret replied. I've lived among Apache families for over 2 years. I've seen them succeed when given opportunities and fail when denied them. The current system isn't working for anyone. Not the Apache, not the settlers, not the government that spends millions maintaining reservations that breed resentment and despair. The room fell silent as the committee members digested her words. Margaret knew she'd pushed as hard as she dared. Politicians moved slowly, incrementally, afraid of dramatic changes that might backfire. But she'd planted seeds of doubt about current policy, and that was more than most Apache advocates achieved. We'll take your recommendations under advisement, Senator Williams said finally. Thank you for your unique perspective. Margaret gathered her photographs and papers, knowing the polite dismissal meant she'd probably failed. Congressional committees took things under advisement when they wanted to end uncomfortable conversations without making commitments. But as she walked down the marble corridors of the Capitol building, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not because she expected immediate change, but because she'd finally found her voice as an advocate. The lonely widow who'd once contemplated suicide had become someone who spoke truth to power, someone whose words carried weight because they came from lived experience. The train journey back to Arizona territory took 4 days, giving Margaret time to process what she'd accomplished. She'd testified before Congress, met with newspaper editors, and spoken at women's clubs throughout the East. The story of San Carlos was no longer hidden in government reports. It was spreading through networks of people who cared about justice. When she finally reached the reservation, Ciala was waiting at the tiny train depot with baby Maria Elena, now a toddler, taking confident steps and chattering in a mixture of Apache and English. Aunt Margaret, the older girl called, running forward with a huge smile. Did you tell them everything? Did you make them understand? Margaret hugged both children tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of desert sage and wood smoke that meant home. I told them the truth, she said. Whether they understood it, well, we'll have to wait and see. But looking at these 2 children, one growing into a confident young woman who moved easily between cultures, the other just beginning to explore a world that might be very different from the one her parents had known, Margaret realized that change was already happening. Not in the halls of Congress or the offices of territorial governors, but in the daily choices of families who refused to let despair defeat them. The Apache people of San Carlos were writing their own future, one small victory at a time. And Margaret Chen, the woman who'd thought her story was ending, had found her purpose in helping them tell it. As they walked back toward the reservation together, Maria Elena's small hand in hers and Ciala chattering about everything that had happened while she was gone, Margaret understood something fundamental about hope. It wasn't about guaranteeing good outcomes. It was about refusing to give up even when the odds seemed impossible. She'd come a long way from the desperate woman who'd contemplated ending her life in an empty cabin. Now, she was someone who fought for other people's lives. Someone whose existence made a difference in the world. And, in the end, that made all the difference in her world.